When I was in college, I went through a severe bout of depression. I rarely slept, or I slept badly with lucid nightmares. My doctor kept trying to find me the right combination of medication to relieve my worsening symptoms, but each drug had side effects and little benefit. During this time period, I spent my nights awake watching movies on my DVD player. It was in the early aughts, and that was the extent of the technology I had access to. In fact, I didn't even have a laptop with Wi-Fi. This was also before smartphones. It was only the second year of having any cell phone for me. My primitive Nokia flip phone had no ability to block or trace a number. Then the calls started. They came from a spoofed number that came up as my own digits, and always between the hours of midnight to 3 p.m. Again, this was before it was common to ignore the phone, and especially from unknown numbers. Even with this in mind, beyond any reasonable explanation, I always felt compelled to answer the call and talk to whoever or whatever was on the line. The voice on the other end was a man speaking in falsetto, pretending to be a woman. The best way I can describe it is that he sounded like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. In the background, the sound of rushing traffic on a busy street or highway filled the pauses in between his words. I got the sense that whoever the caller was lived outside. I was out of it when I picked up the phone. Usually coming straight out of unconsciousness, I would say, "Hello?" and the falsetto voice would answer me over rushing cars. It made me think he was at a payphone under a freeway underpass, or near it. "Who is this?" "You don't know?" He would reply with indignation as though I was in the wrong. "No, who is this?" He wouldn't answer, and so I eventually made small talk. Why, I don't know. I have no memory about what we discussed. At some point after a few of the calls, I asked if the voice was a woman who I went out with a few times, and the voice said yes. Why I asked this, even though I knew it was not a woman, is beyond my understanding. I was in a trance, a suspended state between the consciousness and shallow sleep that made me open to the most outrageous suggestion. Eventually, though, I would snap out of it and hang up, my heart raging in my chest and locking the front door. I would even push furniture against it to ensure that nothing could breach my dark bedroom. Although the call seemed to come from a big city, there was nothing that proved the caller wasn't in my backyard or even sitting downstairs. It happened at least 5 times, maybe more. The last time I received a call from my own phone number in the middle of the night, I mustered up the agency to snap out of the trance and shout, "Stop calling me!" After a pause on the other end, the voice answered, "Shut up!" in a low and guttural scream. A wall of fury blasted out of my end of the phone. It didn't sound human. Out of everything I've experienced, this voice sticks with me and haunts me above everything else. After I told it to go away, the person or thing never called me again. The most logical explanation is that it was a homeless man with a cell phone who figured out how to spoof my number. But it felt much more horrible and dark. My guts churn when I think about it 10 years later. And this is definitely not a fictional story. I wish it was. I'm the youngest of 5, my siblings being 5, 6, 7, and 8 years older than me. So there were times when my parents were out of the house and my siblings were left to watch me. I was 10 years old and it was just me and my 16-year-old sister Dawn at the house. This took place in the summer of 1981. The phone rang and I answered it. The call, who sounded very cheerful, immediately asked for my parents by their first and last names. I remember thinking he sounded familiar, like maybe one of my dad's coworkers or something. Anyway, I told him that they weren't home and he sounded genuinely sad about it. He told me that my parents had agreed to collect some items for him and bag them in brown grocery bags and leave them on the porch. They actually used to do this with clothes and such for charities, so thus far everything was making sense to me. After telling him all right, he asked if I could write down the list of things that he needed. I grabbed the small pad of paper and pencil we kept by the phone and told him I could. We started out with a few normal items, I assumed, since I don't remember what they were. And then he stopped and asked me, "What's your favorite color?" Well, I was 10 and a girly girl, so I said purple, and he responded, "Oh, do you think that's a bit too much for little girls' silk panties?" I kind of furrowed my brow, thinking it was a bit odd, but just answered, "No, I guess not." He told me to put it on the list. He then gave me a few more items and said, "Now, this part is really important, okay? Are you ready?" I told him that I was, and he said, "I need 8 baby bottles of sperm." As you can imagine, I was sitting there writing in my 10-year-old handwriting, and I get to the word sperm, and I'm like, there's something not right about that word. I didn't exactly know what it was, but I knew it was not something someone should be asking a kid for. I told him to wait a minute. I set the phone down and ran into Dawn's room. She was lying on her bed reading a magazine, and I told her what he said. She literally leaped off the bed shouting, "What?" and ran into the den. She grabbed the phone and was shouting, "Hello? Who the fuck is this?" over and over. Of course, the creep had hung up. When my parents got home, I told them what happened and showed them the list. They were sufficiently creeped out, but this was before caller ID and other such tools. I told them that his voice sounded familiar enough that if I heard it again, I'd recognize it, and that I thought he might work with my dad or something. Other than that, there was not much else to do. At Christmas, my mom and I were decorating the tree and the phone rang. I was standing right by it, so I turned and picked it up. It was the same man, and he just said, "Merry Christmas." Unfortunately, I panicked and I just slammed the phone down. I still wish I would have calmly handed it to my mom, because she might have recognized who it was and my dad would have been happy to take care of the situation. I didn't though, and as far as I know, he never called back again. I will never ever forget that happening to me. And now, all these years later, I still think I would recognize his voice. And while I don't actually want to meet him, as an adult, I'd like to punch him in the face. My mom owns her own business and works extremely hard. This means that she spends many late nights sitting on the living room floor with her work sprawled out around her. One night back in 2003, she had her typical routine going, sorting through paperwork and making piles. It was late, close to midnight on a Wednesday, so when the phone rang, she was a bit surprised. My dad worked third shift at a factory, so she assumed it was him. When she answered the phone, there was no reply, just lots of heavy breathing. Admittedly creeped out, she hung up and called my dad. He told her he hadn't called, and she left it at that. Keep in mind, this was almost 15 years ago, and we lived in a small town with practically no crime. We never locked our doors, and we were never scared of dangerous people. But the phone calls kept coming. Every night, multiple times a night. And the person on the end started talking. He started by saying, "Hello, Diane. You're so beautiful. I'd love to meet you." And things quickly escalated into him going into graphic detail of how he wanted to rape and strangle her. Of course, she stopped answering the phone and she informed the police. But nothing was ever done, and the phone would continue to ring. My parents weren't in the situation where my dad could stay home from work, and my mom truly believed that the calls were just empty threats, so things continued on. Until one night he got brave. My mom was sitting on the floor in front of our huge mirrored cabinet with all her work around her when the phone rang. She ignored it as usual. She was concentrating hard on a piece of paper in front of her when a glimmer of light in the mirror caught her eye. She looked up to see a pair of eyeglasses peering at her in the reflection. She spun around to face the front door, which her back had been turned to, and a man was standing there staring at her. She said they both just stared at each other for what felt like forever until she saw the doorknob turn. She started screaming and the man quickly ran away. In light of the phone calls, my parents had started locking all the doors, which was a totally foreign concept to our household. My older brother, who was about 17 at the time and was aware of the phone calls, came running down the stairs with a baseball bat, but by then the man was long gone. When the police came, they scoured our property and came across close to 200 cigarette butts right beneath our living room windows, hidden behind bushes. He had been watching her for weeks. The police also happened to find a bike tire trail coming from the windows and going down the sidewalk. They took the cigarette butts and did DNA testing on them, and they were able to match them to a convicted rapist who lived down the street from us. Robert Ham. Robert Ham was arrested while riding his bike. He went to prison for menacing and attempt to commit a crime. He had many priors, so we assumed he would be locked up for quite some time. The reason why I'm telling this story is because he was released from prison earlier this year. When I was 18, almost 10 years ago, I had a phone call that completely changed my life. I got woken up at almost 6 a.m. by an unknown number. I figured it was my boyfriend, now husband, since his phone usually showed up as the famous unknown number. He usually called me before going to work at around 7:30 a.m., but sometimes he'd call me at 6-ish if he wanted to talk to me while waking up. I answer and he says, "Hey baby," and I'm still half asleep but start talking. He tells me that he has a little problem and that he's feeling really, Being 18 and having to start dating him recently, let's just say I was very willing to, So we start and he tells me how he absolutely loved seeing me last weekend, how good I looked, how he absolutely loved my hot red panties. He basically described what we had done during the weekend, and how much he loved some of the things I did to him. I replied I was more and more awake and we were having a really good time. Then I noticed it was almost 7 a.m. and basically asked him, "So, this is fun and all, but aren't you going to get ready for work?" This is giving me chills typing it, but he basically replied, No, I think I'll skip work today. What about I come over?" Now, the thing is, by then I was pretty awake, and although the voice that was talking to me was very similar to my boyfriend's, something threw me off. My boyfriend doesn't say the, no, like he does. Besides, I knew that unless he was sick, my boyfriend would never skip work because he was scheduled on shifts, and missing a shift was a big deal that could get him fired. I kind of froze. He noticed it, so he said, "Oh babe, you're right. I should start getting dressed, so you want me to come over?" By then I swear that his voice was back to my boyfriend's voice and I just felt silly. So what if he wanted to skip a day at work? Maybe he just wanted to see me. So I tell him, "Yeah, sure, come over. It will only be us here." He replied great, and then he asked me, "Where is it?" Wait, what? My boyfriend knows where I live. He had been coming over for weeks now. I laugh it off and tell him, "You know where it is?" That's when he laughed, and his laugh was absolutely not my boyfriend's laugh. I instantly told him, "You're not my boyfriend, are you?" He then said, "Can you just hang on, please? I need to go grab something." Meanwhile, I get a text from my boyfriend. I figured that maybe, just maybe, this is just a sick joke. Maybe he coordinated it perfectly. Maybe he's sick and his voice doesn't sound the same. The text from my boyfriend said, "At the subway going to work now. Love you." I texted him saying, "Why are you texting me? We're talking on the phone right now." At which point my actual boyfriend called. He was very confused at first and figured someone had hacked into his MSN. When I told him it was by phone, he reassured me that he absolutely did not call me and that whoever it was not him. He had to go though, as the subway train was there, but that he will call me as soon as he was at work. Then the other guy called back and I picked up. I asked him, "Who are you? What do you want?" I pretty much went crazy on him. He said that his name was Mike and that we had met a long time ago and that he just wanted to have fun and that he didn't know I had a boyfriend. I asked him how did he know what I was wearing and what did we do and how he got my phone number. He just said, "Where are you? Why don't we meet?" At which point I hung up. He called again, but I didn't answer. Within minutes, I had called my mom to tell her what happened. She told me to change my phone number and not to stay home alone. I changed my phone number right away and I also alerted the police. They opened a file, but nothing ever came out of it. I still wonder how he knew what we did and what I was wearing. My boyfriend swore at the time he would never let any of his friends know all that, but his parents' house did have a lot of windows and we weren't exactly careful. So Mike, whoever the hell you really are, don't ever call me again. I've been lurking here for a long time and I posted an encounter once under a throwaway, but I just remembered this one and thought I would share. In 2012, I was living in a suburb of a small city with my boyfriend and 2 daughters in an apartment complex in a pretty nice neighborhood. I was attending college and my boyfriend worked in the city, but because I was a young mother in college, I didn't really have a lot of friends at school, and the majority of my friends and family lived about an hour away. One weeknight at about 2 to 3 a.m., I woke up to my phone ringing from a restricted number, and it was a woman crying. "It's your mom, please come get me." I immediately got up and started getting dressed. My mom has had problems with drugs in the past and I love her, but I wouldn't put it past her to get herself in a bad situation. As I mentioned, my family lived about an hour away, but I knew she had friends near me. I was too tired and alarmed to really worry about why she had called me unrestricted. "Where are you?" I asked, and she replied that she was in the city close to me. I pressed her for more details and she just kept saying, "Please hurry, come get me now." For some reason, it started to seem suspicious. The voice was cracking and it sounded less like my mother and more like a man trying to disguise his voice. And they were pushing too hard for me to just leave my apartment and start driving without any general direction to head in. Whoever it was just kept saying that I needed to leave right now. And I think they may have said something about a car breaking down or that they were waiting for me in a car. At the time, my mom didn't have a car or very reliable access to transportation. So in a moment of clarity, I grasped onto it and asked as nonchalantly as possible, "Are you in your car or somebody else's?" They said, "I'm in my car. Have you left?" I screamed, "My mom doesn't even have a car, you fucking psycho," and hung up. My boyfriend was awake by this point and he said that I should have just played along once I knew that it wasn't my mom so that he could go out and find who it was. But I was too shaken up at the moment to do anything else but respond with absolute anger. I never found out who it was. They called back a few minutes later and my boyfriend answered the phone. And whoever it was just breathed into the phone before hanging up. "Whoever the fuck called me that night, please don't do it again." This story takes place in 2005. At that time, I was still in college, but my hometown was a short drive away, so I ended up working at my local library. This part is relevant because I believe the subject of this story attained my info through this means. I've had numerous creepy encounters with people, mostly men, throughout my life. I'm a straight male, but my short stature and boyish looks tend to attract a certain subset of creeps. Though not as much as a woman has to suffer, I can at least say I understand the psychological terror it can instill. But the library seemed to be like the epicenter of creeps. Like this creepy dude who wanted to pay me in private, which is in itself another story for another day. So one morning during the summer of that year, after a pretty heavy night of drinking with some friends, I get a phone call from an unknown number. It was the 2000s, so I wasn't one to ignore calls at that time. And it was coming in at a ridiculously early time, so I was worried it was something serious. Well, on the other end was this guy who sounded like he lacked confidence. You could hear the quivering in his voice. He asked if he could speak to, let's say, Charles. It was concerning some kind of business proposal. I told him he had the wrong number, but he kept insisting that it was okay and he'd talk to me instead. Since this happened so long ago, I was certainly hungover and I can't remember all the details of what came next, except that it was very persistent, somewhat nonsensical, and very annoying, so I hung up on him after a little bit. A week or two would go by without incident, but one early morning another call from a different unknown number came through. Same MO, asking for someone I didn't know about another deal or a house being sold. Whatever he could come up with. Again, I told him he had the wrong number and this time promptly hung up on him after he went through his spiel that it was okay and he could talk to me instead. This started happening with more frequency, seemingly at random since he wasn't consistent with what day he'd call. I still don't know why I continued to pick up unknown numbers, but even with the unsettling nature of the calls, I still wasn't 100% creeped out. Until one morning when I got another call. Same setup, except after I once again told him that he had the wrong number and that I didn't want to hear another proposal or whatever. He said in a really creepy whisper that he wanted to see my neither regions. I told him if he didn't stop, I was going to call the cops. I heard him stutter and then he hung up. Never heard from him again. Now, the reason why I think the library is relevant here is because the place was mostly run by elderly women. They were as sweet as can be and I loved working for them, but they had a penchant of trusting random weirdos with personal information about their stuff. For example, the creep who wanted to pay me learned of my full name and what I was studying in school, simply by asking one of them when they were stationed at a desk. I know that doesn't seem totally weird, but I felt it was a breach of my privacy. Especially after that same creep, knowing I was immediately uncomfortable in his presence, began to come in and linger around me when I was stationed at the checkout counter. So I wouldn't be surprised if the phone creep got my info the same way, or if he and the painter weren't one and the same. So I live in a pretty quiet part of my city in a small 2-bedroom basement apartment with my roommate who is gone for the summer. I stayed here and worked during the summer. I do not get out all that often and don't know many people as I moved to the area 2 years ago. Just this last Sunday night I was doing my usual gaming with some friends I had met on the internet. Good friends of mine that I had known since I was 16. Then I get a call from a private number. Now, I rarely get phone calls from people I know. Normally communication is done by just texting. So I pick up and what sounds like a man maybe in his early to mid-40s picks up the phone. The conversation went as follows. Hello? Hey, who's this? Who's this? You called me. It's Randy. Sorry Randy, you've got the wrong number. I hang up. About 10 minutes later, he calls me again and so I thought, oh, he must have accidentally dialed my number again. So I ignored it and thought nothing of it, continuing enjoying my time with my friends playing some games. By now it is about 9 p.m. to 9:30. Around 10 p.m. I get the call again. Being the not really giving a shit kind of guy, I just ignored it again. After all, I don't know anyone and have not known anyone in my lifetime by the name of Randy. Pretty logical not to answer. I would just be wasting my time. About an hour and a half passes by and it's about 11 p.m. now. I get the call yet again, so I answered and literally the call goes exactly the same way as before. With one problem. I think I ended up saying too much and added to the conversation. Sorry, you have the wrong number. I don't know any Randys. Oh, you don't know me? That's right. Here I'm thinking he finally gets it and he's going to stop calling, but then he says this. Well then, I guess I'm going to stop by and think you'll get a pretty good idea of who I am when I'm done with you. At this point, I was instantly freaked out and I just hung up. I was getting kind of scared, but I got a grip on myself and just figured that he must have beef with someone and really doesn't get that he's calling the wrong person. A few minutes later, I hear a vehicle pull into my driveway. Since I live in the basement and there is a window facing the driveway, his headlights were shining right in. I figured it was just my neighbor coming home from his night shift at the hospital. A few minutes pass by and the lights are still on. Quickly, it all came flooding back into my mind. Oh shit, it's him. I thought to myself, and my stomach began to knot and I felt so afraid that my hands began to tremble. I peeked through the curtains and watched the car for quite some time. I couldn't tell if there was anyone inside or not since the headlights were bright. He doesn't leave, so I call my brother who doesn't live too far from me. I told him what happened and he said, okay, stay in your house and keep the door locked. I'm coming to get you, man. Now, my brother is a pretty intimidating guy if you've ever met him before. 6'4", broad shoulders, big, badass looking beard, etc. He comes over, I let him in and he says, there's nobody in the car. Yet the headlights are on. I pack up some things and we head off. He was kind enough to let me stay at his place for a few days until I felt okay. Upon returning to my apartment today, the same vehicle is in my driveway. I started freaking out, but there's nobody in the car. I noticed blankets on all the seats. For some reason, I looked in the opposite direction right in my garbage bin. And it's my bin and it's labeled and it has the words, "It's me," written on it. I quickly went into my apartment and locked the door and took a shower. When I got out, the car was gone. Honestly, I'm pretty fucking scared right now. Nothing more creepy has been happening all that much. Mostly just paranoia and anxiety getting to me as I try to sleep. I went back to my brother's for the weekend last week and I came home for Sunday night. Things were okay and I slept perfectly fine with little to no anxiety. I was still a little paranoid at random sounds though. Sleep was great until about 1 a.m. when my neighbors thought it was necessary to have some pretty wild sex. Lots of thumping and moaning and screaming. It was somewhat comical, and surprisingly, it didn't bother me that much. Just the notion of another human being's voice, as erotic as it was comforting in comparison to dead silence and random noises that drive me crazy.